As we continue our overview of the book of Judges, we come next in the selected Judges portion to the account of Abimelech, chapter 9. A few features we'll want to note concerning this before moving on to the next judge. First, it's interesting that we have an example of a Hebrew fable. This is quite rare in the biblical collection of literary styles. Now, by fable, we're referring to a story where inanimate objects are given voice. If you think of Aesop's fables or fables from the cultural background that you're acquainted with, oftentimes animals are speaking, are telling stories, or having disputes. In this case, Jotham, who is a half-brother to Abimelech, tells a fable about trees having a discussion among themselves who should be leader. This plays into then the situation where Abimelech has killed off most of his siblings in order to establish himself as successor, as leader in Israel. We also want to notice the evident stylistic expression that's been used to convey widespread killing. What we have in mind here is the observation that Abimelech has 70 brothers, and we are told that he kills off all of them, all 70 of them. And yet, there soon appears Jotham, who is a surviving brother. Our focus here is not on the vicious activity of Abimelech, but rather to notice how this is expressed, what seems to be the literary or stylistic convention employed. On the one hand, it's said that he killed off all his brothers, and yet the account is quite candid to say that there was a survivor. How can these both be? Unless we are to understand that there was a literary or stylistic convention enabling the writer to indicate that the killing was widespread. And so the convention evidently was, they would say it was 100%, even though in reality it was not 100%. We've seen something of this in the book of Joshua as well. Finally, it's worth noting the explicit expression of divine retribution that's visited on Abimelech in view of the violence that he perpetrated. Please direct your attention to verses 56 and 57, the close of the Abimelech material. We read, "Thus God repaid Abimelech for the crime he committed against his father in killing his 70 brothers. And God also made all the wickedness of the people of Shechem fall back on their heads." This is classic retribution language, falling back on their heads. "And on them came the curse of Jotham, son of Jerubbaal." Next in the sequence, we come to the account of Jephthah, chapters 10 through 12. There's some very strong language that leads into the raising up of Jephthah. Let's take a look at that in the early verses of chapter 10. Notice, for example, the response of God in verse 13 of chapter 10. When he reports, "You have abandoned me and worshipped other gods, therefore I will deliver you no more." This comes in response to them crying out to God. You see that in verse 10. "We have sinned against you, we've abandoned our God." And God said, "Well, look at you, you're the one who's abandoned me. And that is, for that reason, I will not deliver you anymore." And then verse 14. What you need to do is go to the gods that you've chosen and cry out to them. If you're signing on with some other deities, then they're the ones you need to appeal to for rescue. When Israel comes back and still asks for God's help, notice the expression in verse 16. They put away the foreign gods, they worship the Lord, and then this, "And he, that is the Lord, could no longer bear to see Israel suffer." It's a very, very powerful statement. God finally relents, but he has been quite candid about his severe disappointment in Israel's repeated decision to abandon him. The story of Jephthah's leadership has, as you will recall, a particularly tragic ending. God does use him to bring deliverance for Israel. And in that process, he engages in a spiritual agreement with God. An agreement which looks like he is seeking to honor God. It seems, from one vantage, to be very well intentioned, to indicate that here is someone who wants to put God in proper place. For he says, if we are successful, if you grant us success, O God, then whatever is the first to come out of the doors of my house, why, that I will devote to you as an offering. And as you may recall, it wasn't uncommon in those days for livestock to share protective shelter within a house. It was oftentimes part of a house that was in effect a barn, and then sleeping rooms for the humans on the perimeter of the house structure. So perhaps he expected that a goat or something, a chicken or something, might come out of the house, and that would be sacrificed. But as you'll recall, it was his own daughter that comes out of the house. And so now he's faced with a dilemma. He's made a vow to God, and the warped sense of spirituality we see here is that he feels obliged to follow through with it, even though there are other passages of Scripture that explicitly prohibit the sacrifice of children. So how could both of these be combined? This is one more example of the tragically confused nature of spirituality that has been blinding Israel as they have let go of their relationship with God. That brings us next to Samson, spanning 12 through 16 in the book of Judges. Here are a few things that we'll want to be aware of. It's impressive how spiritually attentive are the parents of Samson. They're very insistent in their communication with this angelic messenger who seems at times to stand for God himself. And this sometimes happens in the various appearances of angelic beings in the Old Testament. But be that as it may, they are very attentive. They want to be careful that they are adhering to whatever directions this supernatural being gives them concerning the pregnancy and the birth and the raising up of this child, which has been promised to them. So there are certain food products that the mother of Samson is to abstain from while she's carrying the child, and then there are instructions for the child's diet and the non-cutting of his hair, different symbols that indicate that he is to be devoted as a Nazirite, devoted to God. So the parents come off beautifully in this story as people seeking to honor God. Another standout impression or observation from the account of Samson has to do with how he relates to God at these various instances. We have cases where it's said that the Spirit of God comes on him, and typically that's the onset of a display of human power, physical power and force that enables him to do superhuman actions. Typically these are actions of vengeance, actions of retribution, actions that enable him to escape from a predicament. The question can be raised, what does Samson do to merit this? And the story itself does not tell us anything. In fact, if we were to observe some of his behaviors, we would say that his actions would not recommend that God use him in this way, but God does anyway. There's a certain sovereignty about the influence, the inrushing of the Spirit of God at these various junctures. And next, some observations about Delilah, who, as you will recall, was the last woman that he approached. As we examine the meaning of this name, it has a couple of layers of meaning which are instructive. If you were involved in weaving, that is producing fabric, woven fabric in the ancient world, and you encountered the term Delilah would refer to the threads. We might consider them vertical threads of a loom. If you imagine a loom with long vertical threads, as opposed to the horizontal, the back and forth threads that would be shuttled through the vertical threads. Well, Delilah would refer to the leftover edge of those threads, where they would be loose and without interweaving. That is known in English as the thrum, T-H-R-U-M. That is what Delilah or Delilah identifies in the fabric industry. It's those loose, dangling threads at one end of a piece of woven fabric. Not surprising that this might be used to characterize a woman's hair. If a woman's hair is loose and flowing, not woven or tightly bound up, well, you could compare it to the loose threads at a piece of fabric. And this is a typical part of, can be beautiful in a woman's hairstyle. Now, it's interesting that this same name took on a connotation evidently associated with the looseness of hair, which was not so flattering, however, so that it could have the meaning flirtatious. As we think of this meaning, and then re-enter the story of Samson, perhaps then this woman had gained a reputation, or somehow her name had the sense of not only beautiful hair, but also being something of a flirt. And perhaps this is why Samson became interested in her. We know that he was attracted to various women through the course of his life, and oftentimes there were painful experiences that came along with this. You can reread the stories and recall how that unfolded. There's one more layer of association, and this is not a strict etymological link, not the meaning of the name, but rather an assonantal, has to do with the sound. For the Hebrew word that's used to describe the time of day in the episode just prior to encountering Delilah, we find that something happens at night. At the beginning of chapter 16, Samson goes to visit a prostitute. This happens in the town of Gaza, and he is told that people are planning to trap him while he's there. He stays there through or into the night and then makes his escape. Now, the Hebrew word for night is Lila, and by now you can sense the assonance with Delilah, the woman's name that he's going to encounter in the next episode of chapter 16, and the term Lila, night, which describes the time frame for his escape at the beginning of 16. We want to be clear in saying Delilah does not have any meaning associated with night. It's strictly a sound similarity with the absence of light, the time frame of nighttime. The last piece of this that we should keep in mind is that when this theme reaches full form, if we are correct, and that is an assumption, if we are correct in detecting that this is a theme that the writer wants us to pay attention to, the notion of absence of light rather takes full form at the end of the Delilah scene, because Samson is captured and his eyes are put out. So consequently, we could say that he is thrust into a night from which he has no escape until finally he demolishes the temple and the Philistine temple and brings many, many of the local people down to death with him in that collapse. So there seems to be the potential for this theme tracing through his activities at night. He is being trapped by a woman whose name has some sound similarities to the word night, Delilah, and then the night that he is plunged into by virtue of losing his sight, until finally comes his death with another display of supernatural strength. It's been suggested that when we look at the life of Samson, he is in one person compressed something of the experience of the nation as a whole. And you see the suggestions that are bullet pointed before you on the screen. He has taken the relationship, a treasure that he has with God, and he cheaply barters it away through unholy marriage alliances and loves with various women, and God has cautioned Israel against those very things, knowing it would have the effect of diluting their allegiance to him. And as a result of this, he falls into captivity, and he doesn't even realize that it has happened. This is so insightful. This can happen to us as well, can't it? Out of his demise, then, he rebounds, reaching out to God. And God helps him to perform this final act of vengeance against the aggressor nation. The last portion of the book of Judges, as we conclude our overview, presents not judges per se, but rather two stories that give us a snapshot of the extent of deterioration, the moral decay that has tragically gripped the nation of Israel. The first of these spans chapters 17 to 18. It's the account of someone by the name of Micah. Micah commits a theft against none other than his own mother. And notice the cascade of twisted values and morals that unfolds from this. So he is a robber from within his own family. When the goods are produced, he gives them back to his mother. All right, that's a good deed. This is rectifying his earlier wrong. He confesses to what he has done. His mother then blesses him and proceeds to have the silver which he stolen and reproduced turned into an idol, which they promptly go about revering. So this is going wrong. Well, we've got some spirituality going on here. We've got an idol. We've got some worship. Of course, everyone in Israel knows you need to have a priest to make this worship proper. So they make sure they get a priest. It happens to be a priest who's coming from Bethlehem. He's a Levite. And interestingly enough, we are not given his name. He is a nameless figure. We simply are valuing him by his role. He is qualified to engage in spiritual activities. So here's the confusion. Idolatry veneered over by the ceremonies that are administered by someone qualified to do so, a priest. Then along come the Danites, and they are foraging and looking around for room to spread themselves, taking advantage of unsuspecting people up in the north. And they recognize this fellow who's the priest, and they think to themselves, well, we really ought to have a priest. Why should he be a priest over a small group when he can be a priest over all of us? So in the interest of aggrandizing his situation, he acquiesces. Not that he had a lot of choice. They frankly kidnap him. Oh, this is a wonderful way to hire clergy. I'm sure you'll agree. You kidnap them and then force them to become the pastor, the priest of your larger congregation. This is just idiotic. Oh, incidentally, at the end of the story, we find out what is the name of this priest. Here, you can read it for yourself. Here we are looking at Judges 18. And we find that these kidnappers, the Danites, set up the idol. Oh, by the way, they made sure the idol came along with them, the one that Micah had fashioned. And they've got a legitimate Levite to serve as priest. He is Jonathan, son of Gershom. Do you recall Gershom? Well, you see, Gershom's father was Moses. This is the heritage of this individual who's been kidnapped, who's been quite content to serve Micah in basically sanctifying his idolatry, and now he's going to sanctify the idolatry of a whole tribe. So on the one hand, they're so eager to have a spiritual veneer, but the core of their theology is just rotten. There's this confusion. And is this not always the case with the efforts of the enemy? If we were sold just straight out poison, we would know to reject it. But when he sugarcoats it with a veneer of spirituality, then it goes down very, very smoothly. We need to be on our guard, and the book of Judges teaches us this. The last episode in the book of Judges, chapters 19 to 21, are probably the most tragic of the entire Bible. And here we have the account of a Levite who is going back, evidently a mercy mission. He's reaching out to a concubine who is unfaithful to restore her to his home. The concubine's father is delighted to hear that his son-in-law, in effect, has come back, and they have much feasting and merrymaking at Bethlehem, where she has returned home to be with her father. And when finally the Levite and his concubine make their way back to the Levite's home in the north, why then they make their way bypassing or refusing to stay in the Gentile territory of what would later be Jerusalem, the city of that's in the possession of the Jebusites, because, as everyone knows, you don't want to overnight among foreigners in hostile territory. So they make a point to move into Benjamite territory, coming to Gibeah. A brief look at this map of Israel, designed to display the era of the Judges, can give us an idea of the transit of the Levite. He is from the hill country of Ephraim. Perhaps that was in the territory of Shiloh. He traveled south to Bethlehem in order to connect again with his concubine, and they would travel back to his home north in Ephraim. As you can see, moving directly north, he would make his way towards Jerusalem, or Jebus, as it was then known, and that's the city where he refused to overnight. Instead, he goes to Gibeah. Both of those are in the territory of Benjamin. But Jebus was not controlled by the Benjamites. It was still controlled by the Jebusites. Gibeah in Benjamin is controlled by the Benjamites. That's the town where the tragedy occurs. For the people of Gibeah seek sexually to molest this stranger who is coming through. And then an account which reminds us very much of Sodom and Gomorrah, doesn't it? And the angelic figures the messengers who came there, Lot says, don't molest them. And at that point, Lot offers his daughters to be the horrifically sexual play toys of these just evil men of Sodom and Gomorrah. And at that point, the angelic figures intervene and say, nothing doing. They blind the wicked people outside, and then unfolds the destruction of that city with the rescue of Lot and his daughters. It doesn't turn out quite so well for Gibeah, because the concubine becomes basically the sacrificial lamb. And as she is molested and ravaged and finally dies, clawing to get back into the safety of this house. It's an incredibly tragic story. This is the sort of wicked so-called welcome that not the Jebusite foreigners, but the Benjamite insiders, the Israelites in Benjamin, are behaving this way towards one of their own people, a traveler through, who ought to be covered by Middle Eastern hospitality. Well, then you know what happened with the dismembering of the corpse of this dear woman, and the bloody sort of telegraph message that went out to the other tribes calling for justice. This erupts in a civil war. And as the other tribes ally themselves against Benjamin to punish them for what happened in Gibeah, and that's a painful sort of justice as you see how that unfolds. There's a twisted sort of compassion that comes at the end of this, as there are a few renegade soldiers or warriors from Benjamin that hide and consequently survive the civil war, but they are left without any brides because the rest of their population has been slaughtered. And so the other tribes of Israel come to their senses and say, well, this cannot be. We must not have an exterminated tribe of Benjamin. They must be provided with wives to repopulate, build up their families again. And so they go about securing some brides for them. But the way they go about it is by killing some non-cooperative allies, non-Benjamite allies. It's just so totally twisted. There's elements of virtue and value that weave through it, but they're stained. They seem to be hopelessly stained. As a result, this is not a beautiful ending, but it's a powerful, powerful message for us today, and we'll come to that as we approach the application. But before we do that, in the next segment of the video, we'll touch briefly on some literary observations, some of which we've seen already. We'll recap them, some historical observations, closing with theology and application.